Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the great presentation this morning. I was at the colloquium last year, and I'm so impressed by the progress of the organization and so many patients, and sky is the limit, and this is what we are going to talk about today, is what can we do? You know, you have more and more demand of patients, and what can we do to help n-Lorem to build a sustainable model and make sure we have enough funding from our patients. But before we go there, I think we need to understand what are the challenges. To raise more money, what are we facing? And I think, Paul, but before, as you respond, maybe you can introduce yourself and why you are connected with n-Lorem.
Sure. So Paul Compton, good morning, everybody. I've worked in banking for about 35 years, which means I am deeply unscientific. In sitting up here today, I really wear a number of different hats. First and foremost, I am the father of Tayson, who was the young Korean man you saw in a number of videos yesterday. He suffers from a very rare neurological disease called DRPLA. My wife, Andrea, and I are deeply, deeply grateful to n-Lorem because they have kicked off a program for Tayson, and what's really gratifying is there are now 2 other children coming up behind him as well, which is fantastic. In terms of, and just a couple of other hats, I also have the privilege of being on the board of n-Lorem, and I'm also on the advisory council of n-Lorem, which means I get to spend time with Amy and with Stan and others to think of creative channels to raise money for the truly outstanding work that n-Lorem does. The challenge, of course, and Stan made this very clear in his opening comments yesterday, is funding. I mean, we all as parents are deeply aware of the challenges that we have in terms of trying to claim research and development expenses through any private or public health plan that we might be a part of. We've all trodden the path of talking to multiple biotech and pharmaceutical companies about how we might be able to work with them. You know, I remember deeply walking into the office of the CEO of one large pharma company and saying, look, I think there are 5 children in the United States who have this disease, but we do think there are more in Asia, in places like China and North Korea. Are you in? That's a very, very tough sell. Not impossible, but a tough sell. So n-Lorem becomes an excellent option, but also sometimes the only option that you have. n-Lorem is a not-for-profit organization, which means it relies very deeply on the generosity of its stakeholders to really drive its funding. And as you saw yesterday, n-Lorem is achieving outstanding success in a number of programs. And as a result of that success, and as a result of the increasing awareness of the great work that n-Lorem is doing, the amount of funding required to continue to sort of try to keep up or even be anywhere close to the number of applications that we're getting is very, very challenging. Now today, we have some wonderful experts on the panel who are very steeped in creative ways to finance an organization like n-Lorem, including the commercialization of some of the success that n-Lorem has achieved. Now, even that comes with complexity, because as you think about commercializing that success, you need to be very thoughtful and very deliberate about not jeopardizing the not-for-profit status of what n-Lorem is. So we're going to have a great conversation about this challenge and some of the creative ways to get after it. Absolutely.
So perhaps the other panelists, you want to introduce yourself and maybe add, in addition to funding, if you see any other challenge for the organization.
Sure. So I'm Dave Pierce, PhD in biochemistry and molecular genetics, and my journey has been a bench scientist that went from bed to bedside for clinical trial for one of the neuronal ceroid lipofuscinosis, small Batten disease. Then grew a research program for a health system. So I think my contribution to this discussion, ultimately is having lived the experience of, designing a therapeutic which had some impact on the disease, keeping an eye on all of the other developments, which is really cutting edge with what n-Lorem are doing. So my contribution will be that, how do we make this sustainable and attractive, which basically means the earlier identification of patients so we can boost the numbers of patients that can benefit from this. And then from the health system perspective, understanding what the burden to a health system is. But also I haven't heard so much about the insurance side of things right now in terms of reducing that burden of cost on the insurance companies, because until we can actually show demonstratively not just the passionate realization of what we can do for individuals with disease, but what we can actually do for the the actuarialists who count the dollars and cents with respect to this.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, John Maraganore. I'm also a biochemist, but more recently have been involved in building biopharma companies, doing this for the last 40 years. Most recently as CEO of n-Lorem Pharmaceuticals, which I built basically from the beginning over a 20-year period. And so I've seen a lot of what it takes to bring medicines to patients in my career, and have also seen and been involved in raising a lot of capital over the years. At n-Lorem, we raised, under my time there, over $7.5 billion of capital through different pockets, I would say, out there. And I'm looking forward to this discussion to think about how we can raise capital behind this type of effort, which is obviously very, very important. Alan.
Great. So I'm Alan Lutfin. I'm a cardiologist by training, which has absolutely nothing to do with why I'm here today. And I currently run a small drug device delivery company, which also has nothing to do with why I'm here today. I spent the last 25 years of my career kind of buried in the bowels of how drugs get paid for. Most recently, for 3 years, I ran CVS Caremark, which is the largest pharmacy manager. So I really got involved with n-Lorem through Stan, largely because I like to solve really hard problems. And a really hard problem is how do we turn this from being an N of one in science, because this is one of those rare instances where the science is pretty well known. It's the people said in the last panel, it's the legal, it's the contracting, it's the stuff that we should be able to fix a lot more easily than coming up with new science. So that's why I joined. I also am on the board and looking forward to a good conversation.
Hi everybody, I'm Andrew Lowe. I'm a professor of finance at the MIT Sloan School of Management. And so if Paul Compton thinks that he's the least scientific, given he's a financier, an academic on finance is probably even a lower member of the totem pole. So it's not an accident I took the last seat on this panel. I think my contribution will be in using the tools of financial engineering, things that I've spent much of my career studying, and asking about whether we can apply those tools to create better funding models, particularly for rare, ultra-rare, and yes, even nano-rare diseases, because it's pretty clear that there is a need. And for many years, I've spent my time focusing on developing investment strategies for hedge funds, risk management, protocols, systemic risk measures, and also on a commercial basis, ended up raising a fair bit of money for an investment fund that I launched after taking a leave of absence from MIT. And so it's been a struggle for me to understand why it is that something as important as what n-Lorem is doing is so difficult to fund, given how much money has been deployed for so many other activities that have lesser meaning to society. During the financial crisis, we wrote a check to bail out General Motors to the tune of $40 billion. Why? Because General Motors built cars that people didn't want to buy. And so the question is there a way that we can use some of these same tools to try to deal with diseases that are being addressed by the kind of brilliant technologies that n-Lorem has been developing?
Yeah, thank you. And maybe to level set, perhaps, Alan, you can help. You work at CVS, you're a PBM background. So maybe can you help the audience understand, why is it so difficult for payers and pharmaceutical companies to be interested in investing in nano-rare disease?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a long answer there. I'll try to make it short. I can't say hello in less than 10 minutes. When you think about the people who make the decisions around benefits and paying employee benefits, start with them, because that's ultimately where the money comes from, right? They're focused on creating an experience, a good experience for employees. So they tend to think about, how do I have scarce dollars, how do I make the most people like me? So that's why you see a lot of programs for, dental and vision, because everyone has teeth and eyes, for diabetes, because unfortunately a lot of people have diabetes, for mental health. So it's not that they don't want to, it's that the very incentives for them and the way they're measured is, how do I help the most people with the dollars I have? So that's one challenge. The second challenge to overcome is, it was alluded to, is almost the first line in anyone's contract for insurance coverage says payment for FDA approved or cleared therapies. And that's there for a lot of different reasons. It's almost often just ignored, but in this particular instance, it makes it almost impossible for someone to contemplate how to pay for things. And so on one hand, you say, well, just take that away. And there's a lot of reasons we can get into why that's really challenging, but that's kind of one of the ways that I think about is, how do we help the FDA think differently about this scenario in a way that can't be gamed?
John, you're a serial entrepreneur, you build companies. What would it take to take one of those assets and to make them successful? Why is it so difficult to do?
Well, I want to, I'll answer that, but I do want to come back to Alan's point in a minute. I'll start with answering your question. I think that in the wonderful biopharma ecosystem that's been created now for many years, there is this fundamental aspect of investment and risk around that investment tied to a reward at the end of the day, and the reward multiple needs to be meaningful in biopharma for it to work, for the system to work. The failure rate is too high, the capital requirements are too great to bring these medicines to market, and that reward system has to be there, right, at the end of the day. So the nano-rare story is really fundamentally represents a different challenge, fundamentally different challenge. We're not dealing with a big reward. We can talk a little bit about how that reward that might be an N of 1 impossible reward can be expanded to a larger reward. I think that's an opportunity at the end of the day. But I do think, this is why we need to think differently about the cost to get these products to patients and ultimately to an approval, which can be fundamentally different in this case. The probability of technical success, especially with genetic medicine approaches that are very predictable, platforms that are much more predictable. Those are discontinuities in the usual equation of the investment and the reward side of it that can be explored, and I think need to be explored for a sustainable model for funding this type of endeavor. But I do want to touch back, Alan, to your point, because I was thinking a little bit coming in today, and I knew you'd be here, but at some level, why is it really the lack of an FDA approval that prevents third-party insurers to embrace the cost of this treatment as one of their responsibilities? And if so, then are there ways to change that policy, right? And whether it's legislatively or with the insurance community, because this is not going to move the needle for any one payer or, for that matter, employer. And so the question really is there a different way to really create sustainability here around those that fund these type of efforts?
So it's a really good question, and the way I would look at it, maybe the answer, of course, is yes. There's always a way around any. We put the system in place, or we collectively. I think when you look at almost all health insurance in the United States right now is self-funded by individual companies. Companies that go down to even 200 employees generally will self-fund. So the insurance company that everyone loves to hate, they're generally, except for very small companies, they don't hold the financial risk. So they're just administering claims. For the average company of 200 or 300 or 400 or 500 people, whether it's Nano-rare, N of 1, or even the newer gene therapies that are coming to market for hemophilia, it represents the worst form of a lottery that you never want to win. You have all of a sudden one individual who not only will surpass your entire healthcare budget for your entire company, right? Because 300 people probably have a healthcare budget of, I don't know, $6 million. So we have one $3 million claim, it's probably also the entire profit of your company. So we need to sort of figure out, and this is where I think Andrew's insights are incredible, how do we really turn insurance back into insurance and really spread the pool?
Yeah.
I think that's one big question. The second part, and I'm so loath to say this, is one of the reasons that people say we're only going to cover FDA cleared or approved therapies is because the amount of fraud that exists in this country in healthcare is staggering. And I mean, I could tell you stories that would make you throw up. But I know one company, it's a big company, that spent $100 million on a cream that basically had hot pepper in it. And I'm not exaggerating even a little bit. And they had no way that they could not pay for it based on the way they wrote their plan, because the plan's a contract, right? And so if you open up that aperture a little bit to say, oh, well, we're going to cover uncovered therapy sometimes. Well, number one, you're going to get sued by every single advocacy group that's not getting covered. Anyone who doesn't sue you is going to try to game the system to your detriment. And all of a sudden, what is already an unaffordable system will become massively unaffordable. Because, again, the demand is almost unlimited. So that's kind of the challenge. I kind of look at it and go, it would be really nice if we could figure out a way to make this therapy approvable in a different format, right? So that instead of every ASO being a new drug, I understand like at least a little bit that they really are, but get the platform approved in a way. And I don't know if that's even feasible with the FDA. I don't really know enough, but like there are a lot of different approaches we have to think about, because this is also not fundable, I don't think, and again, with all due respect, we could raise all the money in the world on a charitable endeavor. We're just competing with too many other, climate change and poverty and homelessness. There are a lot of good causes out there.
I'd like to take a step back a little bit. I absolutely agree with everything that you're saying there. So the hat I'm wearing today is the chair of the International Rare Disease Research Consortium. So I have the pleasure of, 30 countries. We get in a room. There's funding agencies from, across the globe, talking about, the issues of rare diseases and advances. And in the last 10 years as an organization, we've shifted focus so much from research to really in terms of the public health issues that are associated to rare and undiagnosed diseases. And I can tell you in that room, the learnings that I have is that, even within Europe, the way they view something as newborn screening, which, is potentially one of the impacts that we have here, is viewed very differently. So I think, with respect to this conversation, you just need to engage with every stakeholder and get that opinion with respect to it. I mean, in the health insurance companies, you're absolutely right, but we probably don't bring them in early enough to that type of discussion. And, I personally write letters for the approval of Zolgensma because insurance companies are trying to get out of it because the approval only had certain mutations in one gene. And well, it doesn't matter that other mutations are going to cause the same disruption. And part of that letter I write is that it's going to save you a lot of money. It's going to be, if you don't pay the $2.1 million for Zolgensma, you will spend that much money and that child will die at age 2. So I think the economics piece there, but just to reiterate in terms of the yielding to other people's expertise and understanding in every particular aspect of rare and undiagnosed diseases, because obviously what we're talking about here can make a huge impact with respect to that. And I just think that it's about communication and education. As I learn different things, FYI, the first gene expression model I used to understand gene expression was a financial model using a heat map from finances and that. So the point being there is that the language that insurance companies need to know is attribution and market share. This can drive their market share and this can drive their profits or cost savings in some way.
David, is there, in that organization, is there a discussion about how to spread emerging solutions globally as opposed to just in the domicile they're developed? Because I think about a lot of the different rare diseases that are sort of represented in this room. The economics might not work in the United States, but globally they may work. So is there a discussion about that?
It's absolutely one specific example that we have now is Peter Marks has been talking about convergence of approvals across different countries. So we actually have a working group where they're saying, okay, the EMA and the FDA, the problem there is they're two different agencies and they review their protocols very differently. But if you can bring those protocols together and you've got 10 patients in the US and 10 patients in Germany or wherever, you can converge those. The other part is, the second part of what you're saying is that I deal with a lot of countries that have socialized medicine. And they're looking at this very differently already. So I've been on a number of calls with different countries and also with Australia where the government bodies, the health system bodies of those countries are saying, we know this is coming. How are we going to manage it? So I think that's the other part of yielding to other people's expertise and saying, if we can get some of these examples, to our insurance companies and say, you know what, it may be 100 or 300 hemophilia patients this year, but it's going to be several thousand because right now the pipeline for gene therapies is pretty strong.
The challenge, of course, is like the approval will be a great step, but then you need to get country by country for the reimbursement. Yeah. So it's just take a lot of time. But I'd like to come back to the rare disease because first of all, what we are doing in rare disease is fantastic, but it took 20, 30 years to build. So in Nano-rare, we are really at the beginning of the journey. Yeah. So n-Lorem has been created in 2022, but yeah, it's a movement. So I think we need also to look at what are the progress we can accomplish in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years. And maybe, David, what are the lessons learned? Yeah, and of course things have changed and acceleration of technology probably can help us accelerate. But what are the few things that you think have been instrumental in really rare disease becoming on the agenda of those governments?
I think one of the things I like to say is, and I think all of us need to emphasize, precision medicine is something that is being thrown and bandied around so much more. It doesn't get any more precise than a single base pair mutation in a rare disease that causes that. Precision medicine is founded on rare diseases. And if it wasn't for some of that work now, the genetic testing, which is routine in the oncology clinics, would probably never be where it is today. So I think we need to take credit and say, look, these are the learnings that we've got. And just because it says it's $2.1 million for a particular type of gene therapy, what is the actual impact that we had yesterday? One of the panels yesterday, it was just beautiful, that last panel where and I'm forgetting the names of the people right now, because is it wasn't just the child that was impacted, but the son now goes to school, right? So that, so the societal impacts that we have of all of this is really very important. I think that we need, and we do try to take credit for it in the rare disease field, but apparently we're not very good at it.
Andrew, you mentioned financial engineering, which is key because, when you think about 1 million, 1.3 million, it's a lot of money. And I know in Europe, some governments will say, especially in the UK, if you look at it in the UK, sometimes, and we talk about that, it's sometimes terrible to say, but they prefer not to treat a child than treating him because it costs more money to the system. So I'd like to get your view on that, Andrew, based on your experience and in the US and outside the US.
Well, yeah, this is a very complicated question because, of course, money is not the only thing at issue here. There's an ethical dimension that really doesn't afflict many other industries. The way that the United States makes decisions about risk-reward trade-offs, particularly when it comes to human life, is a concept called the value of a statistical life. When you set the speed limit at 55 versus 45, people will die every year. More people will die. And so how do we decide 55 versus 45 versus 85? And the answer is that the value of a statistical life is a concept that the Department of Transportation and other parts of the government have come up with to use as a way to make these economic trade-offs. And as of last year, the value of a statistical life here in the United States is approximately $13 million. That's the number that we use for an entire human lifespan, so that when you think about the number of lives lost, you put a dollar figure on it and balance that with some of the benefits of your particular piece of legislation. So $13 million per life. What does that mean for a drug that will create a totally healthy child for an entire lifespan and it costs $2 million. In my view, that's a bargain. In the calculus that the government uses, that's a bargain. The issue is how we make that narrative more explicit when it comes to government policy, specifically for the therapeutic development of these diseases. So I think there's a lot of possibilities to improve the situation for rare, ultra-rare, and particularly nano-rare diseases. But we need to start looking at it not just from a purely ethical dimension, but to actually use the government's own language to convince them that actually this is going to save costs and will be in the best interest of the country, given all of the other competing interests that are vying for dollars from the federal government.
So it's so interesting, Andrew. I was actually going to ask you the question because, again, I'm always about trying to figure out how do you use the system to fix the system, right? And so sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. But and again, I'm not a lawyer, but you sit there and say, you're right. If I'm going to make a $13 million decision on whether to fix a road or not fix a road, I should make the same decision about whether to cover a drug or not cover a drug. And there's plenty of ways in the United States to get things to be handled, at least what is perceptually fairly. So again, that's why, like, how do we as an organization, right, not just lobby, but literally use the system to get equal. There's a whole constitutional amendment around equal treatment under the law, right? So if you could make the argument this is vastly unequal treatment, right? Just because everyone wants the speed and not everyone has a single base pair mutation doesn't make a darn bit of difference in the context of equal protection under the law. So like those are the sorts of arguments and we have to make, not just as an emotional appeal, in my opinion, but literally as a way of changing policy.
So there is a policy angle, there is a potentially business angle if we can show that there is enough patient to make a business model. And at Biogen we have this drug for ALS, SOD1, and it's 1,000 patients worldwide, and it's already a challenge for us to make that drug even break even from a business perspective, and it's 1,000 patients. So, but there is a business, if we can have more genetic testing, and it's not if N on 1 become N of 100 and 400, and there is hope. And there is also the philanthropy and raising money. So, the people in the room will probably say, "How can I help?" Because there is long-term policy change. There is this. So, based on your experience, what people in the room can do to help n-Lorem, like raising more funding, advocating. So, and I'd like to start with you because you really saw it from a rare disease. Again, 40 years ago, nobody spoke about rare disease, and today it's becoming a business.
Yeah, I think that, I love what you're talking about there in terms of the price of a human life, in terms of how when they will go on to contribute. I think we need to take those videos of those children and then say, this is where they're going to be in the future, and how they can contribute, and say also how that the brother can now make more of a contribution. And the parents aren't taking 3 days off a week to go to see the different subspecialists and back into the workforce. I mean, I'm tired of hearing about how AI is going to take everybody's jobs. We don't have enough people right now. So, and this really bothers me based on my background, that I have to keep making the economic argument and be creative, and by saying that by doing this is workforce development. Isn't that kind of crazy? That you're treating a child with a nano-rare disease and ultimately you could be impacting 3 other people and creating, a much better economic model for society.
Or do you want to share your?
Yeah, look, I'll give you the perspective as the parent of a sick child. I mean, it is a scale game. The more sufferers you can identify, the more clout you have as a foundation or whatever sort of body you're pursuing a cure through. The more people that you can identify in the US or around the globe, the better for the cause. The one comment I do want to make before we wrap this panel up is, I think every person in this room has a responsibility to help address this funding challenge. We can all contribute in many different ways, and Amy and others, myself, are very prepared to talk to people about how that can happen. There's real resource inside of n-Lorem to help people get after this, but we all have a responsibility to think very creatively about how we tackle this funding question. It's very, very important.
John, do you want to add anything?
No, I would just double down on what Paul just said. There's so many different ways that people can help. It's not just writing a check per se. It could be contributing, effort and resources. And there are companies that are represented here where companies have the opportunity to contribute some aspect of. I know Biogen does it. n-Lorem does it as well. And these are ways in which people can help that are not necessarily philanthropic. But I think it is so important that people contribute to this cause.
I do think the existence of a community in itself is creating the movement, because when you're alone, and I think this is what n-Lorem has done so beautifully, your isolated family and parents now have a voice. And that voice is very powerful, and we are all part of that voice. And I think if we continue to advocate in our organization, with our elected officials, all of that can make a difference. And I think the sky is a limit. I also think it's the beginning of the journey. And long life to Liv Lauren. And thank you very much for all the panelists today.
Thank you.
Thank you.